All right, so for this week before spring break and your midterms, I kind of wanted to talk more just generically about different error examples as well as some, aspects of complex decision making. And then as you're looking at your projects, and since, like we talked about, ubiquitous computing is such an important thing, uh, just a brief review of some of the human computer interaction and design things. So decisions and error. So how do we make decisions? Well, actually, after the midterm, we'll get into some of the specifics about decision making, but fundamentally, we have some methods or tools that we use. So schemas we've talked about. These are your, arrangements of memories and things like that. Instinct. We've all made decisions based off of something like that. Uh, Intuition. And these are kind of, vague, squishy terms. So, interpret them how you will. But sometimes we have just kind of a sense of what to do. Rationality and logic. So this is your weighing options or working through a process. Satisficing. This is a big one that most people do. We're choosing not the optimal path, but the least bad path. And then probabilistic. So you're trying to make a decision based off of likelihoods. So we're going to go through a few slides on like just different examples of some of these and just kind of talking through some of this. And I figured it might help as you prepare your midterm. So um, some examples here. So differential diagnosis is one that is interesting and recently relevant for our class, right? Um, so differential diagnosis is the way that doctors and medical professionals diagnose with, looking at different symptoms and trying to, determine what's the most likely cause of symptoms or the most likely culprit. This is going to rely on schemas, maybe you developed during medical school or practice or different things like that, but also a probabilistic view. And this is a quote that you'll sometimes hear about getting parroted in different medical fields or something, but they're taught in a sense of when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. This is the sense, right? This is a probabilistic sense of you have symptom X, Y, and Z. 80% of the time that means diagnosis A, but and maybe 15 more percent it's diagnosis B, and 5% it's diagnosis C. This is why, especially if you have a complex medical condition, a lot of them have a hard time getting help from the medical community because, they're not predisposed or taught to look for zebras. But that's the question, right? What about when it is a zebra or a wildebeest or another hoofed animal, so to speak, Um, and this kind of probabilistic, make the decision based off of the maximum likelihood aspect, is a way that a lot of decisions get made. And when we think about it, when a doctor gets it wrong, did they make a mistake? I mean, obviously, in some instances, for sure, but if they're just wrong because of maybe something they weren't aware of or something they've never seen, we deal with that when we're looking at human performance. How do we evaluate human performance? And a lot of this is trying to understand what the person's trying to do, where are they coming from, and what's their decision making process. So this is kind of an interesting one where it's pretty variable, and uh, and it's interesting. My wife has an autoimmune condition, and it's interesting to watch doctors try to, square those circles, so to speak. So next, so the Boeing 737 Max incident, not the recent door exploding one, but the plane crashes that were occurring in, you know, far as I think it was Malaysia or Indonesia. I can't remember exactly, but um, there were two crashes with significant loss of life. Um, all the Boeing 737 Maxes were grounded worldwide. Um, it was kind of a whole production, and it started, the decline. Boeing's been on for a few years now. So the Boeing 737 Max is a wacky situation because, um, we had those instances of wrecks and or crashes, and the reason why is due to an automatic or automated angle of attack correction. So to kind of explain this, your angle of attack is, that's a phrase about the particular angle of ascent or descent that you're taking from a runway. So, if this is our runway, your plane, doesn't, there are different angles that your plane can take. And the Boeing 737 MAX issue was caused by this automated system that would pull the nose down if it thought the angle of attack was too high. So, if we go back here, so if our angle of attack is going like this, what it will do is it'll act to drop the nose of the plane to smooth out that angle of attack. That's the idea. Um, but one thing that was interesting is these planes were flying around the world, and we only had foreign crashes, but like specifically in less developed nations and things like that. And that was a question, right? Why did that happen? And one of the big aspects that came out was maintenance levels and training issues. So in some of these, less developed nations, these planes were not maintained at the same level as they were in Western nations, where this, and also keep in mind, this angle of attack aspect where it forces the nose down without pilot control was known in the West. We were, very aware of that. And so they were trained on that. But, you get pilots flying in underdeveloped nations, you have poor maintenance and things, that's a struggle. And this angle of attack automation was based off of sensor data, and for the planes that crashed, the sensor was incorrect. So it was forcing, essentially, as these planes, as they were trying to, go up, it was thinking it was an extreme, it was thinking it was like this. When in reality, it was like this. And what it did is it forced the nose down, and, this is our ground, forced the plane to crash. And so this is kind of one of those aspects, right? Of like, okay, we got maintenance levels. This is maybe a latent error aspect. We also have training deficits, possibly. But recall, U.S. pilots did have this problem as well. They just, the sensors weren't failing, and, they were trained in different ways to mitigate it. So when we think about this, right, decision making, we're looking at these are schemas, from the training. Intuition and instinct are both critical things for, drivers or pilots or any of those kind of aspects. These are prominent things that we consider and that we think of when we think of a good pilot or a good driver. The other thing is to think about, and this is something we'll get into more and more probably, and you all will with your midterms, is pressure. So one of the interesting things, right, is that Boeing essentially, certain safety review and verification functions that typically the FAA does were actually delegated to Boeing to do it themselves. So they were kind of grading themselves. Not a good process. FAA, was in that position due to budget cuts and things, but obviously that's not an effective process. And there were economics pressures here. You have to get these planes out. They've got to work, and that's still been a struggle for Boeing. So the next one, the next couple are just wacky things that I remember. So there was the St. Louis Dispatch, if I remember right, is a prominent paper in St. Louis, Missouri, And one of their reporters was essentially trying to get data from a government system. I believe it was on education funding or salaries or something, and came across uh, an issue where within the HTML code, not directly displayed, but within the actual code, if you were to view source or inspect element in the web browser, it had exposed a bunch of people's social security numbers that were in this system and things like that. The newspaper called the government agency to be like, "Hey, you guys have this problem," and the response, oddly enough, was that the governor accused them of hacking. I believe they tried to file charges against the reporter. Um, it was a very peculiar response, especially in the cybersecurity community, right? We consider cybersecurity, the discovery of zero-day exploits and stuff is a big reason that bug bounties exist. If you're a up and coming cybersecurity professional, you can take on bug bounties where companies will pay you rewards for finding bugs. Um, so this was kind of interesting, and the governor really pushed it pretty hard. Again, political pressures. I mean, there might be other things. Also, probably a lack of awareness of technology. Calling this a hack when it's not. It's publicly available because you can just see it as a function of the browser. Um, so I had this thought. Is this a peer check? Um, in a sense, right? This is a peer check. When we think about it from human performance, that's somebody trying to, check you and make sure you're doing the right thing or things are all right. The newspaper didn't go public with any of the information or anything. They just informed the government what was going on, which I thought was a prudent step. But it also brings in problems with just culture and safety culture, right? One of the things we found in nuclear is, and I think a lot of other critical industries discover this, if you are extremely punitive to people that bring up problems, they are less likely to bring up problems. And then you're just not aware of the problems, but the problems persist. So, that's an aspect we think of. That's part of safety culture, and then Sidney Decker's just culture, which ironically was actually born from Boeing in, I believe, the 90s. But that's an aspect we think of, right? What if this was a different situation and a reporter discovered, uh, hey, you published a bill with a bunch of, metadata in it that are problematic, and the agency or whoever, responded with punitive measures. Well, then no one's gonna do that anymore, and you're still going to be publishing public, maybe inappropriate medical metadata or something, and that's struggle. So that's part of what we think about with human performance is the willingness to participate. This is kind of a as George Costanza would say, we're living in a society, so we all kind of have to join in. This is another similar instance that was really peculiar. So the there were some pen testers for, if you're not aware, pen test stands for penetration test. You can do pen testing digitally where you're trying to hack a system and you're assigned to do that by the people that own the system. You're looking for bugs. It's a little bit more structured than a bug bounty. Or physical penetration tests are also common where, it's, hey, can you get into our secure building and plant USB drives in, location A, B, and C. And then if you can, you then write up a report with security recommendations to make that less likely. So this happened in Iowa. A couple guys broke into a courthouse. They were hired by the state judicial branch, so the state level agency, to do a penetration test of this facility. The alarm went off and they continued their work. That's one of the things they're testing, right? and the police department showed up, as they do. One of the critical aspects of pen tests is usually you only have a few people that are in the know of what you're doing, and you typically have some documents that are like a get out of jail free card of like, hey, no, seriously, that we're actually here for this. Call this person. In a company that might be like your chief information officers or security person or something. So anyway, they explained to the police officers they were hired by the Iowa Judicial Branch, etc., and they were then arrested and charged with trespassing and a bunch of other stuff. Um, Depending on the news reports, right? Some of the stuff with government gets into political things. It sounds like there may have been some issues between the county level sheriff and the county level authorities that are in charge of that courthouse and the state's judicial branch. The crazy part, right, is the entire like security community came out and were like, "What are you talking about? It's not these people's fault that they signed a contract with whoever you're saying is the wrong agency. The point is they did not trespass in an unlawful way. They didn't commit a crime. They were doing it in pursuant to a contract." But they were arrested and charged. They were released on bail, and it was pretty significant. It took the Iowa 3 months to exonerate them, and the district attorney was not going to until a state legislative hearing was held on the matter, and then there was some downward pressure from the state legislature to drop it. So, how does this, when we think about human performance, right? Did the pen testers do anything wrong? Well, they did the physical pen test. By all accounts, they did the physical pen test in accordance with industry standards and how they're typically done. Um, they are entitled, there's usually a scope of things that they want you to test or things you can do, things you can't do. Um, and there was no allegations that they violated that. The only problem was this issue here with state versus county shenanigans and politics. So, how do we consider this? This is the decision made on the best information available. These people were contacted, they were paid money to do a thing by a legitimate government agency. It just happened to be that there was some finicky situation between these agencies. So that's another interesting thing, right? Not explicitly a human performance failure, um, but again, we get to that decisions made on best information available. Even the police officers, though, right? These are county sheriff deputies in Iowa that may not be even aware of what penetration testing is. So, that's another thing. They were likely making the best decision that they had at the time. These people are saying you caught them breaking in, and now they're saying they are allowed to, and they've got paperwork. Like, I could see if you weren't aware of the penetration testing community that might be like a bit hinky to be, as an excuse. You'd think, oh yeah, that's rich, but still one of the more interesting kind of weird failures and responses that out of a legitimate innocuous thing. So then, just again to further, complicate your minds before spring break and your midterms, I wanted to go over some of these aspects. A couple of these we've covered before, but so the first one's moral luck. This is a very particular ethics question in philosophy. If this really, scratches an itch for you, I strongly recommend you reach out to Dr. Baumgartner in the philosophy department and ask him about courses to take. But moral luck is essentially this theory of, if morality is absolute, or I guess it's questioning, can morality be absolute? So when we think of, can people do the wrong thing? In human performance, right, we're looking at action and impact. Now, in philosophical terms, there are actions that are wrong even regardless of an impact. But the moral luck argument that the example I recall hearing is somebody is driving home drunk. and they run off the road. Nothing happens. They're able to get back on the road, no property damage or anything, and get home. So there's some tire tracks, and that's about it. Or, however you want to say, another instance of this, or parallel universe, whatever thought experiment you want to pick. Uh, the exact same thing happens. Car goes off the road in the exact same place, and in the exact same manner. But there just happens to be somebody standing where the car's going, and that person's killed by the wreck. People would tend to attribute greater blame and greater, you know, just erroneous behavior to the second one, even though the actions of the individual are the exact same. And so that's one of those funny things to kind of think about when we think about human performance, right? We've already talked about, can we ever have errors? Well, yeah, and there's arguments to be made there, but for our instances, yes. But errors are unintentional actions. So, and I think this is partially where just culture was born, where you wanted to um, not punish people for unintentionality, but have them be agents out there essentially constantly beta testing your world to make it more resilient. But that's an interesting thought experiment. There's a lot of other aspects of moral luck, but that's kind of the gist. And so I want you guys to kind of think about what that means for human error, human performance. And then we talked about probabilistic decision making. So, like how doctors are doing a differential diagnosis. So one of the things to recall is people are poor statisticians. Even trained statisticians are poor statisticians, and this has been proven with psychological research and studies, where people with advanced degrees in statistics still would make incorrect decisions where there was a statistically optimal choice. So, that calls into question just the whole fundamental nature of probabilistic decision making, right? So, how do we make decisions? And this is something we all do. This isn't just a doctor thing or a trained white collar expert educated thing. We're all making those decisions. When you're driving to the store, you take a path, maybe there's a shortcut that you've taken forever and you've never had any issues with it. Well, you continue taking it because the likelihood of something going wrong to you is minimal because you've already done it a bunch. Now, that doesn't work statistically, right? Every instance of driving down there is a new statistical test, so they can be argued to be independent. And I always think of the 2016 elections. So, I think, Nate Silver, popular political commentator, pollster dude, had said, the odds of Donald Trump winning were 3%, and Hillary was 97%. And then when he was wrong, everybody flipped out and said it was all bunk. But what people don't realize, right, is that's saying that in 100 possible instances, 3 of them, Donald Trump won. And we just happen to be in the 3 of them. On occasion, you reach into the drawer and you get the winning one. On occasion, people win the lottery. It's an instance, right, of that. And so probabilistic decision making, that's one of those weird questions, right? We all do it, but we don't do it in a statistically valid way always. And so how do we kind of think about that? This next one's efficiency versus resiliency. So this was just on my mind because I'm writing a paper about it now. So, and for us, there's organizational efficiency and resiliency, but we need to think of personal efficiency and resiliency. So, when we're looking at this, right, and I'm arguing in this paper that efficiency and resiliency are fundamentally linked, in the sense of a gain in efficiency will likely create a drop in resiliency to the point where a maximally efficient system is also maximally fragile. And how does this reflect with human performance? When we think about doing something fast because we're well practiced or whatever, we're incredibly efficient at it. But are we as resilient? If you're doing something incredibly fast, you will still make mistakes, and you may have less chances to catch them. Um, this is one of those things to kind of consider. And last, I just want you guys, especially since you're looking at different events or situations, to think of latent errors and the resident pathogen theory. So we've covered this before. Latent errors are those hidden errors in a system or process or organization or person or whatever that we're not immediately aware of, but they, sit in waiting, so to speak. And then the resident pathogen theory is the latent errors serve as these resident pathogens in organizations. Um, and they may be asymptomatic until they're not. This is covered a lot more in Reason's book. So if you want to double back to that for your presentations, feel free. Um, but that's something I wanted you guys just to kind of be aware of, right? And the difference between latent errors and active errors and things. So now, like I said, we're going to take a brief rerun through a human system interface. So, and this will go kind of quick, but again, it's just to keep this top of your mind where, there was once upon a time where our interfaces with systems were not computational. That time is long past. So in some of your instances that you're looking at or events, you're probably going to come face to face with some kind of a digital interface thing, either a problem or maybe it worked well or whatever your situation is. So again, we want to talk about how design can influence and support human performance or decrement it in a way that's notable. So I'm pulling this is a nuclear regulatory guide, but I like this because it's extraordinarily thorough. And I'll read through it kind of quick or skim through it, I guess, but feel free to pause if you need to read it yourself. So a human system interface is the part of the system where personnel interact to perform their functions and tasks. When we think of components of an HSI, we're thinking of alarms, displays, controls, procedures. Their use can be influenced by factors like the organization of HSIs into workstations, the arrangement of workstations and supporting equipment, the environmental condition in which the HSIs are used, including temperature and humidity, etc. And the use of HSIs can also be affected indirectly by other aspects of plant design and ops, such as training, shift schedules, work practices, management factors, or the plant safety culture. And since this is from a new reg, this is something the nuclear industry is bound by. So going back here, right, you can use whichever one is most appropriate, just be consistent. Typically, if you're explicitly talking about a computer, you use HCI. If you're explicitly talking about a machine, I think of like the interface I have with my snowblower, which is just buttons. There's no digital screen. But even if there was, it's still just buttons and things. Or maybe my sprinkler system would be a good example here. It's a human machine interaction thing. But if you're somewhere in the middle there's a mix, just pick human system interaction. I think that tends to be the one I like the most anyway. And like we talked about before, what if everything is a computer system and machine simultaneously? And like we talked about before, sometimes human-centered design is a more effective term. So again, going back to that new reg, the HSI design process is an applicant has to submit an implementation plan or results summary report, and these are descriptions of the inputs to the HSI design process. So the concept for use or how the HSI will be used, this is our ConOps, concept of operations document, as well as the detailed HSI design guidance that was relied on. So what style guide did you use, or if you deviated, why and when, and description of how the design minimizes the effects of degraded INC and HSI conditions on the performance of personnel. outcomes of tests and evaluations undertaken. So this is where we get into, we've talked about before, like design testing or when we think about V&V, or which is also verification and validation, that's an aspect of some of this. And most digital systems go through some version of these. They might be less rigorous or less thorough, but these are pretty common design features. So concept of operations, I'm not going to go through this thorough. I copied this over because I wanted you guys to have these really thorough definitions of these things as you work through your process with your midterms, and maybe something in here sparks something. But pause it and just read through this. But fundamentally, your ConOps is the context, environment, just everything about how this system, process, or machine or technology is going to be used or operated by humans. So it's a very broad category, and it can be all sorts of things. There's a ConOps for literally everything. There's a ConOps for your car. There's a ConOps for your computers. They have to understand how you're going to use your computers and in what context. So that's an important feature. HSI style guides, so you can find these, and this is one of those, be aware of your industry, because there might be defined style guides. In nuclear, we have New Rego 700 here. It's not, you're not bound by it per se, but if you're going to deviate, you have to have a good explanation why. But your style guide covers all of your design choices. This is your colors, fonts, spacing, all sorts of things, and it creates a sense of consistency across your design. Style guides should be the result of as many iterations as possible, right? As you iterate and polish your design, it should get better. And requirements should be expressed precisely and list any exceptions, if any, to the requirements. So this is one of those, if you're going to deviate, you have to explain why. Now, like we talked about, HSI, design and human error, we want to design a system that works for people. And, these are some of those principles, right? You have to remember, if you design a system that runs against how the human's going to perform naturally, you will get increased error rates. That's just the way it is. There's no arguing it. You can't train away a different decision-making method. That's not a thing we can do, at least not right now. Digital design's not bound by traditional physical constraints. That's actually a benefit typically, but something to be aware of as well. Understand the broader digital design system that your users operate within. This is where we get into aspects of inheritance, which we'll talk about in a second. And what happens to your PRA, or probabilistic risk assessment, when a pump comes to work and decides to be a valve, or when your lawyer comes to work and decides to be a doctor? We run into these differences of mental models. So just again, recapping HSI history, we had the mainframe era where, there were, several computers in the world, and they were gigantic, and you had cards and various things. Then we had the personal computing era that, everybody got access to some kind of computer. And now we're in ubiquitous computing. And this is, if you're interested, pause it and take a look at this. Can I expand this? Not easily. Okay. Well, take a look at this comment because it's pretty funny. Design inheritance. So ubiquitous computing means that all devices have an experience and an HSI concept. So this is specifically for nuclear, but this can be applied to any of your other processes as well. Your systems need to align with user expectations, which are now defined everywhere. That gives you a larger design space for novel digital systems, means you can take more chances because it's more likely that your novel idea isn't so novel, like in the broader field, and you may be able to find some, pros and cons or best practices. You get a potential increase in risks. with ubiquitous computing, more just your error space is bigger. But you also get higher learnability. They will be able to train up faster if they're familiar with the process and with the overall technology. Um, and yeah, this is again from New Rego 711, but HSI mods should be designed as far as possible to be consistent with users' existing strategies for gathering and processing information and executing actions. So, remember, the primary rule of all digital design is that you are not the user. And this is kind of a simplification of the false consensus effect, which is a psychological bias, I guess, or heuristic, where we tend to overestimate how many people share our choices, beliefs, tastes, values, or judgments, and alternatives seem deviant and wrong. And just try to remember, users and user evaluation guide design, not designers. One thing you may come across in different evaluations of events in the sense of users were not taken into consideration. That is the most common problem that you'll find. So the Hicks-Hyman law, we talked about this a little bit, I think, but the more choices oh, my image is all over my text here. Okay. Well, the more choices a user has increases the cognitive response time in a logarithmic fashion. What's that mean for us? It means that our reaction time will plateau, which is something we need to be aware of. It's a big consideration for complex systems because it's a big consideration for complex systems because most complex systems will end up maxing out reaction time anyway because of just the number of options that are present. So, and because it's logarithmic, it's not going to go up linearly or anything. So it's something we just have to be aware of and prepare for. Fitts law, we talked about this. This is why your cursor, your corner of your screen is technically infinitely wide because you can't miss it. So the time it takes to navigate to an element is a function of the distance from the cursor and the width of the UI element. So something to be aware of. This is, again, not up for discussion, really. It's been the way it looks like. So if we think about human cognition and HSI and kind of human performance, the digital world's not the real world, but, or I guess, and learned affordances and mappings of the physical world may not explicitly translate. This is one of those things with skeuomorphic design. If we try to make it realistic, we might be relying on affordances that just don't work in the new space. Mental models, this inheritance is here, of more popular systems. And if you're running counter to that, it will increase error. So here's the questions and kind of the principles, right? Can you train a design that is counter to expectations? No, not successfully. You can totally train it, but you're still going to have more errors than if you just designed to expectations. You always need a design for communication and feedback. And this is kind of a restatement of the first point, but if you design counter to human ability, you will get human error. And as designers, we try to remember human weaknesses: probability, future forecasting, self-judgment, and memory. These are limitations that we take into consideration as we design new systems. An example of this is stimulus response capability. So this is this image here is an example of stimulus response testing that's been done. So the goal of the user should also physically map to the action. So in this first instance, right, left is on the left side of the screen, so the person hits the left button. But over here, the text is on the right side of the screen, but the person still hits the left button. This is where we're talking about, okay, your users associate the position on the screen with the direction, not the text. This is something you'll only find in user testing a lot of times. So you want to make sure that you're mapping to real world location, and you need to keep localization in mind. Localization here just means if you're designing for a population that is different from you in some fundamental cultural way, you be aware of that so that you are aware of their mappings and affordances that they're bringing into your systems. Speaking of mappings and affordances, so a mapping is when the item is clearly communicating its function and use. An affordance is that the item clearly communicates the process and functions that it supports and that are possible. It's very contextual. What I recommend, because this is a really weird, nuanced definition, is what I'd recommend is pause this and just pop over to Google and look at examples of affordances and examples of mappings. And that might help kind of clarify it because it can be hard to parse. And these are Norman's goals from Don Norman's work. It's essentially a circular nature of action, right? The world gives us. Let's start up here. We have a goal. We want to execute the goal, so we step into the gulf of execution, where we try something, and we try it based off of our decision of how do we work it and what can we do. That then is an input into the world. We get a new world state, and we evaluate if it meets what we wanted. That's a trial and error loop. So novel situations will call for this trial and error loop to detect purpose, failure, and success. And this is something we have to keep in mind, right? And it runs into design inheritance. If you're dealing with design inheritance, people are not going to ask these questions. They're going to say, I know how to work this. Why doesn't it work? And that's going to kind of be their process. So it's something to consider for us. Information visualization. This is something you might run into in your events, but it's also not likely, but it's something to also be aware of as just a citizen member of society, right? Information visualization is a really easy way to mislead people. It challenges our visual processing and spatial reasoning in a way that can be, easy to be tricky with data. So the purpose of information visualization is to communicate data. We use specific elements like graphs, charts, implications, or curves. We're trying to tell a story. So when I say implication and curves, by the way, that could be you don't represent these bars, but you do this. We want it to be simplistic, avoid three-dimensional or flashy traits because they just add cognitive load. That's actually one of this. If you look closely, this is a three-dimensional bar chart, which is just unnecessary cognitive processing. We try to avoid relative comparisons if details are important. That's why if you're interested, this is a fun topic. It's a kind of a pet topic of mine. Pie charts are terrible. They're the worst option in 99% of situations because people are not good at relative spatial awareness. You also want to take caution around novel applications of established models. If you're going to use a bar or a line chart in a way that it's not typically used or to represent data that it's not typically used for, that's a dangerous game. And new visualizations typically should rely on skeuomorphism or realistic design. So that's where we think of a thermometer shape for temperature readings. Your icon, your actual UI might be a thermometer shape to communicate clearly to the user, this is a temperature. And so we try to, again, make use of what affordances we can to increase the legibility and just functionality of the system. So a couple of bad examples of bad design that are my favorite. We've talked about some of the others, but I actually had this as a sticker on my laptop for a while, and I didn't know actually what this button did until I actually had a truck. This will turn on the light that is above your truck bed, but it just looks like you're launching Octopi out into the world. And then this is a really gobbledygook homepage for a designer, very artistically valid. Note the colors that are being used here, but this was probably kind of hard to read for you. It won't be in a second because our brains learn. This will kind of be like that process of with the plates being flipped. But anyway, uh, for this design, if this is what comes up, and the only action you can take, I mean, you can click around, nothing happens. But for this website, if you went down here into the red, nothing happened, which was an odd choice by the designer. But if you went up into the blue, this is what happened. The blue would expand to cover this, and because of the specific nature of the blues and reds that were chosen, it would overwrite this, and now you'd have that, which was always really interesting. But not a very artistic and clever design, but not useful. Let's see, does this work now? So, okay, I want to show you guys this in a little bit more detail. So now, go back to this since you've seen it. Since you've seen this, you can now read this. And that's one of those examples of strange cognitive behaviors we have, right? So research methods, these are just for your awareness, these are just kind of as we go from abstract to concrete or conception to completion. These are generally the specific usability methods we will approach it with. Sometimes there's different ones. Like for example, I like think alouds and heuristics evaluation even earlier. It's just kind of a general rule of thumb. And this is one of the most true memes ever made. Whatever you design, they will not use it the way you thought. So something to keep in mind. So that wraps up. I hope you guys have a good spring break. What we're going to do is the week after spring break, let me know on Slack what your schedule is that week, and I'll set up, an hour and a half or so for you guys to present your midterm topics, and then we'll kind of have a back and forth since we're a small group. So, yeah, that's the plan, and I hope the rest of it's enjoyable.